Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and I want to thank you for joining us for the Arc of Jeskai last time. I hope you really enjoyed it, and we're going to take a little break before we start the next arc, and we're going to have a one-off lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how players are using some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. Just as a quick aside before we get started, if you've been enjoying the Arc of Jeskai, any of our other Color Theory episodes, or any of the retro episodes that Ryan from CCO has been putting back up on the channel, let us know about it in the comments, or if you think we've earned it, give us that like, that subscribe, whatever app you're using to enjoy these episodes. But considering how hefty the topic we're going to talk about today is, I want to get started right away. And I want to dive right into it. First, I just want to do a shout out real quick to two groups that really helped me solidify these ideas that we're going to talk about together today. First, I'm going to link down in the episode description to the episode of the Mind Sculptors, where Ken Bauman was on talking about one of his ideas on the different patterns of how winning occurs in cEDH. Great episode. Again, link will be down in the comments. I also want to shout out an episode of the Playing with Power podcast where they talked specifically about what we are going to talk about today with window theory. But before we can talk about window theory, we really should first review some of the information we've talked about before with the different stages of a game of Commander. We've done whole episodes on this before, but briefly, there are 3 stages to a game of Commander. And they're easy to remember with the simple mnemonic, ready, set, go. Ready stands for getting ready. This is the phase of the game where no one's really interacting very much. Everyone's just kind of doing land go or land ramp go. The second stage of the game is the all set up stage of the game. Ryan and Brando talked about this on a recent episode of Commander Cookout, where Ryan kind of said this is the point of the game where you can reach twice the average mana value of your deck, so you can expect to multi-spell. I like to be a little bit looser in that definition, but I basically agree with what Ryan had to say on that episode. Essentially, when you're all set up, you have your resource engines in line in such a way that you are able to expect to be able to cast multiple spells on your turn, or potentially be able to both develop your own game plan while holding up for interaction for what your opponents are trying to do on their turns. Which brings us to the third stage of a game of Commander, going for it. When you reach the going for it stage of the game, you are willing to trade down on resources, meaning you're potentially 2 for 1ing or 3 for 1ing yourself in terms of cards spent, in order to go towards bringing down the clock that your opponents have before you win the game. So now that we've reviewed that, let's talk about, well, what do we mean by window theory? What are windows? A window is a point in a game of Commander where your opponents lack the ability to interact meaningfully with the game plan that you are putting forward. Your opponents are usually lacking one or more of the following: mana, cards in hand, or sometimes something like blockers or cards in play. While I like that in the broadest sense, window theory can be used to explain just about any activity we do in a game of Commander, from when is the window for developing your mana rocks, to the window for trying to get a threatening creature out on the battlefield. But what we are going to focus on instead today is the most commonly used parlance, the window for winning the game. So let's get more specific. A window is a point in a game of Commander where your opponents specifically lack the capability to interact with your attempt to win the game. The reason why we had to talk about the stages of a game of Commander a few moments ago was because unless we first defined what it means to go for it, it's a little tough to see exactly when a window is going to crop up. And I mentioned in the introduction that there was a really great episode of the Mind Sculptors, where Callahan interviewed Ken Bauman talking about one of the patterns that Ken noticed in how different people and different decks would win games of cEDH. Ken described 4 patterns by which players would attempt to win a game of cEDH. And those 4 patterns were win, win through, win after, and win because. We're going to go through these one at a time now, and we're going to start with the first one, win, or as I like to think of it, win before. This is where you present the win and your opponents just don't have the resources, often they don't have the resources yet, to be able to stop you. These are your turn 1 and turn 2 win attempts, where in cEDH you just go, oh, I happen to have it. Thoracle, Consult, can anyone stop me? Or Breach, can anyone stop me? These are the turbo wins that often end the game very, very quickly, and usually when opponents have already tapped themselves out to develop their own game plan. Next, number 2, is win through. This is often the most classic type of win that you see in a game of cEDH. You have taken the time in order to sculpt a hand where you have your win condition and the protection you need to force it through your opponent's attempts to stop you. This is when you go ahead and you cast your Silence, crack your Ranger Captain of Eos, or just so happen to have backup with Pact of Negation and Force of Will in your hand when you go to play your Thoracle Consult or your Underworld Breach. Essentially, this is when you have the interaction to stop their interaction. Number 3, win after. This kind of gets back to the old phrase of early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. Essentially, because an opponent attempted a win on the turn before you, you're simply the first person that gets to untap and use all of their resources to try to win the game against opponents who have just depleted their resources trying to fight through a win or trying to keep somebody else from winning. You're just the first person to get to take advantage of that opportunity, and it can lead to a pretty powerful win. Number 4, win because. This is where one of your opponents takes an action which removes an obstacle that was previously in your way. And with that obstacle removed, you just go ahead and win the game. Maybe you were stuck behind a rule of law, so you couldn't Thoracle Consult, but one of your opponents decided to remove that rule of law for their own ends. And as a result of that, now you have the ability to just go Thoracle, Consult, shuffle up and play again. And if you really want to feel like a winner, don't forget, as part of CCO Media Group, Gemstone Mine is sponsored by FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. I know that when I was at a tournament a few years ago, I had some sleeves that had seen some play, and I got questioned about it by the judges and issued a warning that my sleeves were too beat up and too dinged. I should have checked on FusionGamingOnline.com, where I could have gotten my choice. I mean, they've got both Dragon Shields, they've got Ultimate Guards, my 2 personal favorite types of sleeves, and I may have gotten away without any kind of a warning in that case because my sleeves would have been minty crisp and new. If you need gaming supplies, singles, anything else, I mean, Thunder Junction should be out by the time this episode is out. You can get them all using the promo codes that are on the screen or down in the description below. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. So the reason I wanted to bring up Ken Ballman's Patterns of Victory in cEDH is that those patterns really go a long way to reveal different windows which occur both naturally and artificially in a game of Commander, both cEDH and normal, classic, casual Commander. I describe these in 3 different types of windows. Starting first with the early window, the window that is open at the very beginning of the game when players just don't have the resources to interact. You may have remembered we talked about win or win before as the first of the different patterns that Ken described. Early in the game, before opponents have access to adequate mana, or they just kept a hand without any interaction, you may be able to just get your win out there and nobody can really do anything about it. This is the only real natural window in the game, but it's very difficult to take advantage of. You really need to skew your deck in such a way that it is built with a lot of fast mana in order to take advantage of this window before it closes. Getting back to our talks about the stages of the game, this window is going to open on turn 1 when everyone is still getting ready, and you have to be ready to go for it before all of your opponents are already all set up. We mentioned that turbo decks in cEDH can often exploit this with a critical mass of rituals like Dark Ritual, or very powerful zero-cost mana rocks like Mox Diamond and Mana Crypt, but sometimes you get lucky or you can mulligan very aggressively in order to force through an early win. Finally, sometimes you might just get lucky in seeding order and be in that first player seat. This means you will often have multiple turns where you have a drastic mana advantage that you can try to exploit, while your opponents are trying desperately to catch up to the state you are in the game. The next window I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call a forced window. This is a window that a player is going to force open through the actions that they take, consciously trying to go for it and end the game. They may have developed something like a Ranger Captain of Eos that they can then crack on the turn they want to go for it, forcing that window open and demanding opponents interact while the Ranger Captain of Eos' ability is on the stack. This can also classically take the form of having developed a very strong hand with multiple pieces of counter magic, a silence in hand, or maybe you're playing a stack which has effectively landed a rule of law and you've baited out your opponent's one spell per turn while you have a way to play around it. The downside to this is that this window is going to slam closed after you try to go for it, and if you don't make it, usually you're going to be way far behind in cards and other resources while your opponents may have only expended a small amount of resources trying to stop you. Control decks classically try to win this way. You remember during our Month of Azorius, or I guess I'm going to retroactively call that the Arc of Azorius, Step 3 to playing Control is to win comfortably. And basically, you are trying to force open a window through the sheer card advantage that you have been able to accrue throughout the game. Non-control decks will classically try to win this way if they have very mana-efficient combos or other win conditions. Like we've been talking about Thoracle Consult for a while. There's a reason it sees play in so many decks in cEDH. The final type of window corresponds with Ken Bauman's patterns numbers 3 and 4, which are win after and win because. In both of these cases, this discovered window essentially is going to be when one of your opponents takes an action, which then results in a window opening for you to take advantage of. In win after, one of your opponents has forced your other opponents to expend resources trying to stop them from winning, or stop them from taking another extremely threatening game action. When this occurs, you then are in a position to be able to untap and present your win, not quite unopposed, but with much less opposition than you might face otherwise. In the case of win because, one of your opponents instead does something that opens up the way for you to be able to win. If, for example, you are on an Underworld Breach deck where you are going to be graveyard dependent, one of your other opponents might remove that Rest in Peace or that Grafdigger's Cage, which was originally stopping you from winning, but was also hampering their game plan, so they inadvertently create the context that you need in order to go for the win. In both cases, this is kind of the optimal scenario to be trying to win in. You are not expending resources to force a window open. Instead, you are trying to pounce on a window that opens, and may only be open for a short period of time, but it is much less resource intensive in order to take advantage of these windows. This is why you will classically see mid-range decks being described as being able to pivot so conveniently between different A, B, or C game plans. In these cases, these decks have the ability to quickly access and assemble a win condition when it seems like a window may be presenting itself. Certainly, there's some skill in this too. If you are a really good talker, you may be able to politic your way into getting your opponents to remove a piece that's in your way, or try to convince somebody to go for it into another person's interaction, freeing you up with the opportunity to take advantage of this new window. And sometimes it's just dumb luck. The person in front of you went for it or happened to remove a piece that was stopping you, and you just had the combo in hand, and there you go. You present your win. Now, window theory is useful outside of cEDH. There's a reason why we're talking about this on a lesson from cEDH, where the idea is that these are lessons that are applicable to any table, any players of Commander. And window theory is no exception. Let's try to look at some of these windows at a casual table with casual cards. Most decks that we would consider casual essentially lack the ability to take advantage of that early window, when your opponents do not have the ability to interact meaningfully. Usually you're not going to be seeing a lot of turn 1s and turn 2s at casual tables, but you may see them develop more powerful effects on turns 3 and 4, and when there is a lot less interaction in the opposing decks, sometimes they may just be able to ride that to victory. Again, not usually a very, very early win, but if somebody gets down that turn 1 Krenko and then turn 2 drops a Goblin and a token and then taps Krenko to make 3 more goblins, and could very quickly run away with the game at that point, simply because nobody had that early interaction to stop the Krenko player from going off. The difference is that most casual decks are not built in such a way in order to aggressively mulligan for those very fast starts. So in most casual decks, the early window is going to open naturally and then close naturally. Very rarely will you see a casual deck really built to go for it with that really early game plan. Since most casual tables are going to be lighter in interaction than most cEDH decks, this also means that the forced window is a lot easier for casual decks to take advantage of. However, there is a trade-off. You see, most cEDH decks are built in such a way that the clock on their win conditions is exceedingly short, usually 0 turns. That means that if you get that Thoracle Consult down, well, nobody else is going to get a chance to untap. The game is just over. Outside of cEDH, though, you're going to notice that most of the win conditions are going to allow for multiple turn cycles where your opponents are going to get to untap and see new cards and have a new chance to formulate a new response. This means that the interaction that these decks do need to go through when they are trying to force a window open, they're going to need to potentially defend their win condition for 2-3 turn cycles before they can really close out the game. In this way, it's a bit of a trade-off, whereas a cEDH deck really only needs to be able to defend its win con for those couple of seconds that it's on the stack. Casual decks are going to need to defend their win con potentially turn after turn. So I guess at the end of that, it really is kind of a wash, where it is still going to be a very resource-intensive operation, even for a casual deck to try to defend its win condition. When you're thinking of win conditions like this, think of classic and infamous casual win cons, like a one-sided Cyclonic Rift, or a Craterhoof Behemoth, or, if you've really been around the block a few times, old classics like Insurrection also fit the bill here. Discovered windows, on the other hand, are usually a lot less obvious in casual games than they are in cEDH games. It's not a matter of this very clear line that opens up when a single stacks piece or other piece of interaction is removed or expended. It's not very common that somebody in a casual game is going to threaten Thoracle Consult, and then they're going to need to eat removal from the rest of the table and soak up counter magic, allowing somebody behind them in turn order to do their own Thoracle Consult. In practice, it's often much more like a very long line of dominoes falling into place. That line of dominoes could have started 3, even 4 turn cycles ago, when a really troublesome commander that was pressuring your game plan was removed by another player. For example, I love playing my Trelasara deck, and maybe that big beefy Voltron commander pressuring life totals really inhibited another deck's ability at the table to be able to breathe freely and develop its own game plan. With Trelasar out of the way, now that Simic deck had the chance to build to a powerful endgame and take over once the Trelasara, the threat to their life total, had been removed. Another example of this might be if a player gets removed from the game, such as a Voltron deck manages to destroy player 3, knocking them out of the game, thus creating a cascade where now player 2 is free to be able to do what they wanted to do in the first place, get their combo online that was originally being stopped by the pieces that player 3 was playing. It could be any number of other different scenarios. But usually, decks that have a dedicated win condition, and not, I've achieved a critical mass of creatures slowly over multiple turns, and now I'm going to try to just do combat damage to win. When there is a dedicated win condition, something like Craterhoof Behemoth, that is a way for these decks to quickly pounce when these discovered windows open. So now we have to answer the question, how do we take advantage of these windows when we are playing Commander and when we are building our decks? Because yes, you can build your decks in such a way that you are able to take advantage of these windows. Let's start with the one that's toughest in casual first, with Turbo. And to be frank, the social contract usually is built in such a way that you don't want to be the person who is going for it with all the fast mana. To be clear, there are some tables where you are not quite playing cEDH, but people are okay with those really fast wins. They are packing more interaction than the average casual table. Alternatively, it may be a deck when you build around a commander like Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth, which provides explosive ritual-like mana. Or it could be a deck that has a commander who gets out of hand really, really quickly if left alone for 1 or even 2 turn cycles, like Krenko Mogboss. Most decks, I think, though, in a casual play space, are going to take advantage of those forced windows. So if you're trying to optimize your deck to take advantage of these, try to think about, what does the board look like when your deck is going for the win? What does your side of the board look like, and what is the optimal scenario for what your opponent's boards look like? Obviously, you are not expected to be able to shut down all of your opponents all by yourself and predict what they're going to do. But it may guide you in your card selection when you are building or tuning your deck in order to optimize for that scenario. For example, if you happen to be on a beatdown game plan, you may want to make sure that there's lots of times when your opponents have no blockers available. This is one of the reasons I love Kismet effects, like Blind Obedience, forcing your opponent's creatures to enter the battlefield tapped and giving you more opportunities to beat in for combat damage. Take a note from cEDH as well, and consider including cards that are going to give you lots and lots of chances to build those forced windows. Silence effects that will prevent your opponents from interacting with your game plan. Offensive counter magic, which will allow you to force your game plan through even if your opponents try to interact. And you may be able to make substitutions for that too. Protective spells, like Flawless Maneuver, other cards that give your board indestructible, like Boros Charm, or maybe just a card like God's Willing that gives a creature protection from a color till end of turn. These can often be enough in order to protect your board and let you force your win through. In terms of commanders for this, you may want to consider a card like Miram, Sentinel Worm, which not only makes it very hard to interact with, as it does have Ward 3, but it often makes the 1-for-1 removal spells your opponent's running much, much worse, because essentially every card you cast in those big dragons is going to come down and give you a token copy, meaning your opponents are going to cast the removal spell, remove the original, but you've still got the token there. It makes it much less efficient for your opponents to interact meaningfully with what you are trying to do. As we kind of hinted about, talking with the different mid-range strategies and how they often are well positioned to pivot and take advantage of discovered windows, you can do the same thing at casual tables with the decks that you are brewing. The main trick here is that in order to take advantage of these windows, you need to be able to see a lot of cards relatively quickly, so that way you have the cards in hand to take advantage of the window when that discovered window presents itself. So this may mean you're running lots and lots of card draw to filter through your deck to get to what you're looking for. Scrying can also be really, really helpful with this. Even if you see just 2 or 3 cards a turn instead of the one you normally would draw, that can sometimes be enough to really let you assemble a game plan. Also, don't forget to lean into what your deck's color identity is good at. If you're in a base green deck, that means you have access to some of the best creature tutors in the game. Take advantage of those if you're looking to increase your deck's accessibility of its win conditions, and try to look into creature-based win conditions. Or, on the other hand, if you're in Boros, maybe you're going to look for an equipment-based win condition. If you're in Blue, maybe you're going to look for an instant or sorcery to try to win the game with. The better you'll be positioned to take advantage of those discovered windows. If you want to build your deck to be able to really take advantage of them, you may even look at commanders like Korvold, Fey-Cursed King, who by virtue of the sheer velocity of card advantage that deck generates, can very, very easily assemble win conditions in even the most minute of discovered windows. So that about does it for this episode. I really hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please, you can give us a like, subscribe, you can leave us a comment, and be sure to check out the other stuff that's going on Commander Cookout Media Group this month. I know that Brando and Ryan have been pretty excited about some of the stuff that's coming out of Thunder Junction, and I think there's a couple of interesting deck techs coming up. Of course, if you want to check out the newest program on Commander Cookout Media Group, Mac and Ryan have been releasing an awesome series on Commander history. If you like to see and analyze how different sets impacted Commander as a format, it is one of the best ways you can spend an hour. I'm loving it. If you're not already tuned in and subscribed, you're missing out. Of course, if you want to reach us on Gemstone Mine, you can leave us a message right here in the comments on Commander Cookout Media Group on YouTube. You can also get in touch with us directly, where we are at Gemstone Mine MTG on Twitter, or you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.